Hey, Shabbat Shalom, friends and family. Thank you guys so much for joining us for Romans chapter 9. We are talking, the title of this section is God's Sovereignty and Israel's Calling. We're going to look at the breakdown that Paul gives us on a few things. So, Paul starts by, through verses 1 through 5, he starts by telling us that he would do anything to get his kinsmen to see the truth about who Messiah is. He goes on to tell us as he breaks this section down that the people who are called Israel, his kinsmen, he qualifies that by saying, according to the flesh, to them belongs adoption as sons, the glory, the covenants, the giving of the law, the temple service, and the promises. So, what is he saying here? He's saying all of these things have been given to them. They've received all these things. The Lord has done all these things for them. Now, I want to be careful to talk about this because Paul's going to break some things down for us that can be confusing if we're looking or focusing on the wrong thing. So, right here, he is showing you that the Lord gave them all these things. As a matter of fact, if we come over here in verse 5, he says that actually all these things originated with the Father, and they actually ended up coming from the Father through Christ in the flesh, and now Christ is over all forever. And so he's connecting these two things, saying, yes, all of these things came, he brought all these things to Israel, but in order to bring about the Christ, Yeshua HaMashiach, Jesus the Christ, who has now become over all, and he is now over all forever. And then he's going to make some very bold statements that we need to take note of as he breaks this down. He says in verse 6 and 7 that the word of God has not failed, and all of the people that are descendants of Israel are not all Israel. That's a really important statement. Not everyone that is from the nation or descended from the person of Israel is considered Israel. He says, and doubles down on that by saying, not all children, they're not all children because they are Abraham's descendants. So not all children, not all descendants, not all children, not all Israel. Just because they're descended from Israel doesn't mean they're Israel. And just because they're descended from Abraham does not mean they're the children of Abraham. And he says this through, he quotes the verse that says in Genesis 21, 12, that through Isaac your descendants will be named. So who was Isaac's son? He had Esau and he had Jacob, and Jacob became Israel. And that is who we're talking about. The son of Jacob, or the son of Isaac, who is Israel. And that became the name by which the sons of Abraham, the people of God, were known. So look at this now, because this is where we see the grafting in of you and I. It is not the children of the flesh who are children of God, Paul says, but the children of the promise are regarded as his descendants. So Paul goes on to tell us what that means, what is meant by children of the promise. Well, he talks about how Sarah shall have a son. This is prophesied, verses 9 through 13. He's talking about these things. That Rebekah also would conceive twins, and the one would be the father Isaac, and that's where the promise would come from. And he even describes that promise and says that the older will serve the younger. Jacob he loves, Esau he hated. Now this is where we get into a discussion on sovereignty that I don't know how much we want to bite off in the discussion, but you guys can look at that. But we can get the impression in the verses that are going to go in this section and throughout this particular study that the Lord has marked some people for destruction and some people for exaltation. And this is where we get the idea that a lot of Zionists have, where they would say something along the lines of Israel's been chosen and nothing can happen to them because God's hand is on them. Well, I would agree with that, but Paul's defining for us who Israel is. The sons of Israel, not all of them are born from Israel. Not all of them are the sons of Abraham. But if we take a little bit of a step back approach on this issue here, is it really talking about the sovereignty of God in the sense of him picking and choosing who's going to be destroyed and who's going to be exalted, who's going to be saved, who's going to be um, condemned from the very beginning, or is he giving a broader aspect and showing us that it just because things are happening in the flesh, things are happening in the natural, does not mean that that is going to be his way of doing things. Let me tell you where I'm going with this. Not any of the patriarchs were the firstborn. Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Abraham was not the firstborn. He had an older brother. Isaac was not the firstborn. He had an older brother. Jacob was not the firstborn. He had an older brother. But the promise should pass through the oldest brother or the oldest sibling. But in all of these cases, that was not what took place. The younger one was chosen. This is how the promise was coming, not through the natural selection of that firstborn, but through the spiritual selection of the secondborn, is how he is choosing to set this up. So maybe it's talking a little less about a sovereignty aspect and a little more about how it's not just the natural. So he talks about having mercy and compassion on those he chooses, that it doesn't depend on the man and what we will, but on God's mercy. And then he goes into this idea of a lump of clay. Again, I think this kind of doubles down on what we're talking about. From the same lump of clay, let's call that clay Israel, people who are descendant of Abraham in the flesh, that whole lump of clay, some of that lump of clay is going to be set aside for honorable use, other for common use. Notice it doesn't say destruction, it says common use. Anyway, so if we continue to break that down, we've got common use, but then we also have him saying a lot of things in verses 24 through 26, that he called people not just from the Jews, not just from the people who are descended physically from Israel, but from Gentiles also. And that he talks about the prophecies that come from Hosea. I will call those who were not my people, and her who was not my beloved, beloved. And in the place where it was said to them, you are not my people, there they shall be called sons of the living God. So we get to specifically see, not only is he going to choose from that lump of clay uh, in Israel things, people that will be used for honorable, people that will be used for common, but he is also adding to the lump the Gentiles, where we are now grafted into this promise. And he says, in the place where it was said to them, you are not my people. So even in the history where we've seen people say, oh, well, you can't be part of Israel because you weren't born of Abraham, you don't have the lineage, you don't have all of these other things. He said, in that very place, I will lift them up and they will be called sons of the living God. So very clearly, he is defining Israel for us. Paul actually makes this conclusion. On the left, we see Israel, the people who were his physical flesh, the kindred of his physical lineage. He said Israel, they were pursuing a law of righteousness, but they did not arrive at that law. Why? Because they did not pursue it by faith, but as though it were by works, and they stumbled over the stumbling block. In verse 32, he tells us. So if we go back to the beginning of what we said, what did they stumble over? Christ. They stumbled over Messiah because they thought all of this was going to be through Israel, the nation, and that their good works was going to establish their righteousness. On the flip side, he tells us Gentiles who did not pursue righteousness because they didn't know the law, attained righteousness, even the righteousness which is by faith. So this is the conclusion we get to. And I love this formula if we look at it this way. So the law that they were trying to pursue, plus works, which is how they thought they were supposed to pursue it, minus faith in Yeshua, meant that they did not get to a place of righteousness with the Father. But then in the Gentiles come along and they had faith and they coupled that with Jesus, Yeshua, and that doesn't get us out of the works of the law. What it actually does is it equals us moving into the place where we are actually doing the works of the law of righteousness. And righteousness comes to us because of that faith in Yeshua and faith in the process of what he's told us. So lots of things to discuss there. You guys have a wonderful discussion, and Shabbat Shalom. God bless you.